Right, this is an introduction to Pro Tools video, primarily for those who needed a little review on Pro Tools and digital audio, and especially for those that have never seen Pro Tools. I wanted to just talk about a few of the main tools in Pro Tools and how to get around and navigate. So this is an introductory video before all the videos. I would also encourage you to watch the Avid Introduction to Pro Tools video that I'll make available to the class as well. All right, so the first thing we kind of have to talk about is your platform or your OS. Are you operating on a Mac or a PC? If you're operating on a Mac and you've never ran a digital audio workstation on a Mac, it's a little bit different. For instance, you'll notice even on this particular screen, if I change the program I'm running, the menu is going to change at the top. The PC doesn't do that, so that's one thing to be aware of. The program we're going to be using is Pro Tools, so after you've installed it, it should show up in your dock on a Mac. Now my dock is showing, but some docks are hidden, so it either is usually going to be on the side or the bottom. Let's go ahead and open up Pro Tools. The other thing that you can't see on this video is I have my dongle plugged in, or my iLock, whatever you want to call it. Pro Tools has to have something to validate the program. For this particular demonstration, we are going to work from a blank session, kind of start from scratch, but I wanted to show you one thing as a review from your RecTech course or your introductory audio course. I opened up this little arrow here on the bottom that says session parameters, and you probably wondered, well, what did I learn in RecTech? It's been a couple years. Well, you probably learned that there are several types of audio files, uncompressed and compressed, and when I use the term compressed here, I'm talking about files that have data removed or do not have data removed. So for instance, files like MP3s, AACs, even M4As will have some type of data removed. The types of files that are uncompressed or are full quality are WAV and AIFF, and you'll notice those are the only two choices that Pro Tools gives me, so that's handy. So WAV is traditionally a Windows audio version, AIFF is traditionally Mac, but nowadays we kind of work between both. And in fact, when we get into NARIS standards, in the National Academy of Recording Arts and Sciences, they'll tell us that the standard is going to be broadcast WAV. So let's just go ahead and stay with that for now. The next thing we got to ask ourselves is what bit depth do we want to record at? And once again, you probably learned this in RecTech or your introductory recording class, but you kind of forgot what bit depth was. So let's go over that. All bit depth is basically the ruler that measures digitally the variations in amplitude. So in this case, it's voltage because your amplitude from your microphone or whatever is transduced into voltage. So that's going down the wire, and then you plug it into your computer. Inside the computer, it's going through a D to A or A to D process, depending on playback or recording. So the question is, how many measurements do we want to take of that amplitude? That's really what we're asking here. And if we're talking about amplitude, we're also talking about dynamic range. So maybe you remember that term as well. So a 16-bit recording has about 60,000 ways to measure amplitude, and a 24-bit recording has about 8 million ways to measure amplitude. So you might always say, well, why don't we just always record at 24-bit? Well, one reason is because the CD quality is 44:116. So you have to decide, is CD the highest quality I'm ever going to put this project on, or do I think perhaps I'm going to want to put it on a DVD later? Most smart engineers, and my personal preference would be to record at as high a bit depth as you can. Only because you never know what's going to happen with your master in the future. So once again, 60,000 ways to measure the amplitude and 8 million ways. And if you're talking about specific dynamic range, this has 96 dB of dynamic range, or 96 decibels of softest to loudest. This has 144 decibels of dynamic range. Now, one thing that's just introduced with Pro Tools 10 is something called 32-bit float, and a lot of people ask me, well, does that even increase the dynamic range more? No, not necessarily. It only uses those last 8 bits in the sequence to do processing, so that's going to give you a more accurate processing of your reverbs and things like that, plugins, but it's not going to actually affect the amplitude of the audio. So really, we're choosing between 16-bit and 24-bit. In this case, since I'm not using a lot of reverbs or plugins, I'll just go ahead and go with 24-bit. Why not? The next question is, do you want your files interleaved? That means, do you want, if you import like a stereo file, a left and right file, do you want it to make it as one file, or do you want it to make it as mono files? two separate files. Typically within the program we like to work as mono so we can affect each channel. So moving on to sample rate. So we just talked about amplitude, which is bit depth, so you're probably guessing then that sample rate has something to do with frequency, and you're correct. Remember from RecTech we had a term called bandwidth, meaning the range of frequencies that are affected or represented by the system. So you probably also remember that 48K takes 48,000 measurements of the sample or of the audio waveform per second. We also have some other options. We have 44.1K, 88.2 kilohertz, and 96 kilohertz. And if you have a really expensive converter, you can go up all the way to 192 kilohertz, and that would measure a sound wave 192,000 times per second. So I believe Nyquist, when we learned about him in RecTech, he said that basically the frequency that we want to capture, we need to take double those amount of samples. So since we can hear as humans up to about 20K, depending on the human, if you're old like me, maybe a little less, but we definitely want to take at least 40,000 samples. So all of these are covered here. So if I was to record maybe a symphony orchestra or ensemble for triangles and cymbals, something with a lot of high frequencies, I might go up to 88.2 or even 96. But for just a pop or rock or country recording, I'm actually fine with 44.1, only because that's what it's going to end up on CD. And remember, MP3s are even lower quality than any of this. So really, we're still talking about the CD standard here. Okay, enough theory there. Moving on. So the next thing it's going to ask me is, where do you want to save the session? Okay. It's always good, and I'm kind of breaking the rule today, to have an external hard drive to work off of, especially on a laptop. Basically what I'm saying is I don't think it's very smart to run your program and your audio files on the same drive. So if you can put your session on a separate drive and run the program off your main disk, that would be the best of both worlds. That way your computer's not working hard to try to access the files and access the program on the exact same hard drive in different sectors. So that's kind of a rule of thumb. The other rule of thumb that I've seen students do is try to work off thumb drives. That's a no-no as well. Thumb drives are flash storage, so they're not very fast, and you're going to end up probably losing some data in the transfer. So you don't want to work off a thumb drive. You want to work off an external hard drive, 7200 RPM or faster. And most externals are that nowadays. So I'm doing a no-no, and I'm saving my session on the desktop. That's fine for now. So let's go ahead and save that. And I'm just going to call this Intro to Pro Tools. And you'll notice I have keystrokes on the bottom, so when I get into some shortcuts, you guys are going to be able to see those on the bottom there. Okay, so a few things popped up, and they may or may not pop up on your screen. I just wanted to let you know that. You can set kind of your defaults as you want them. For instance, my transport popped up, and I also had all these other things pop up here. Yours may look totally different, so don't be scared if your screen doesn't look like mine. We'll just keep moving here, okay? All right, so the next thing we need to talk about is just the concept of nonlinear editing. The biggest advantage of digital audio workstations, besides being able to store the digital information for hundreds of years and have it be preserved as the same quality, is what we call nonlinear editing. Back in the days of tape machines, I had to fast forward like this. Okay, I'm fast forwarding to where I want to get to. Nowadays, with nonlinear editing, I can click anywhere on the timeline and move from one place to another. Okay, so that's one term I might throw out as nonlinear editing, and I just wanted to make sure what you guys knew what that was. So let's go ahead and open an audio file so we'll have something to mess around with, and it'll start to look a little bit more like something that we can work with. The other thing I just kind of want to mention in general is with Pro Tools 8 and above, anything that has a drop down arrow is pretty much your friend. It's going to be able to tell you something, or you're going to be able to change something. So I'm going to go ahead and look at this particular drop down, and it's asking me, do I want to show these comments? Let's just get rid of all this stuff. That way I can have some more real estate on the screen. So that's this particular little drop down here. And then I might end up showing them later. Track color, we'll get rid of that too. Okay, so that way I have a little bit more real estate to open a file. So I still don't have any audio in this session. I'm going to go ahead and go up to File, Import, Audio. Now, all of a sudden, you'll start to notice that there's several menus in Pro Tools, but also there's all these little things right next to the commands. Those are what we call key commands or keystrokes or key shortcuts. If you are an experienced Pro Tools operator, instead of taking the mouse up here and wasting your time going back and forth, you're going to start to use keystrokes. So the more experienced you are, you're going to see guys and gals that have been in the studio a long time just using primarily keystrokes. However, since we're just learning Pro Tools here, we're going to get used to going up to the window first. So once again, I wanted to do track. No, actually I wanted to do file import. I'm sorry, file import audio, because I'm going to import a drum beat just to play around with. And I already have this drum beat here from my library. So here is the import audio window, and so whenever you're importing something that's already been recorded, you can do it this way. Okay, looks like my Dropbox is being quite active tonight. Let's see if I can turn it off. Oh, it's all right. I think we're good. I'm not going to go into it. Anyway, getting back to the subject. Let's go ahead and import this drum beat. What I always do, and I encourage you to do too, is click this little arrow that says copy. What that does is it copies the file to your particular session. Otherwise, if I would have just clicked add, which is the one you think you'd want to click because it's blue, it references the original location. So let's say this file was, let me just kind of go back and say this file was on my desktop and I would have clicked add. Well, if I threw that away, then the original reference back to here, it wouldn't have a file anymore. So what copy does is it copies this file into my session, so I always have it with my session. Just a smart thing to do. So where were we? We were file, import, audio, and I'll have to go back there again, and I'm going to copy it. You can also preview if you want to say, oh, was that the file I wanted? Let's go ahead and check that out. Okay, so it's a funky drum beat there. Cool, that works. Some other things about this particular window, it's already telling me the original file 1644.1, so I'm going to upsample that to 24, and that actually doesn't increase the quality of the original audio file. It just makes it fit our session. So, but it's stereo. It was recorded at 44.1, so that's all good. Apply sample rate conversion. Typically, it'll do that if and it'll check that box if it needs to convert something from 48 to 44.1. So that's really nothing to worry about. This is the quality. Tweak head is slow, so that means it's going to take its time converting it. And then it's going to ask me where I want to put it. So I called this session Intro to Pro Tools, right? And it's on my desktop. Within that Intro to Pro Tools, there's several different folders, and it's asking me where I want to put it. Well, 9 times out of 10, it'll say audio files will just be the default, and that's where I want to keep it. So I want to keep all my audio files in the audio files folder, duh. So we'll do that, and then it's asking me, do you want to add it to the clip list, or do you want me to actually create a new track? So let's do a new track. Boom. So now this drum beat's way over here, and you can see it's very small, but I do have it imported. Let's go over, just while we're at it, and look at what we call the session folder. So this is the session folder, and for most projects in this class, when you turn them in, I'm going to need the whole session folder, unless I tell you otherwise. So going into the session folder, what you should have in your session folder is audio files. Obviously, since I already imported that one's in my audio file, that 100 BPM going on drum beat. I have clip groups, okay, so I haven't really created any clips, so that's not going to be full. In fact, I haven't created any video, and probably no, it did one backup. This is an automatic backup, and you can set your preferences in case your power goes out or whatever. It'll back up the sessions automatically for you, so that's a good thing. This is what we call the session icon, so just like Microsoft Word would have a .doc, Pro Tools has a .doc PTX, and it used to be PTS. But since it went to Pro Tools 10, PTX makes sense. And I think I was talking about this in class, but basically, if you have a PTS, you can open it in Pro Tools 10. However, if you have a PTX, you can't open that retroactively. Like you couldn't open a PTX in Pro Tools 7. So once again, the manufacturers are smart and try to get you to buy the newest version. But anyway, you'll see all this good stuff is in my session folder, and I always want to keep it all in there, no matter what I can do to keep organized, because if I want to take this file over to Joey Bob's house and drag it to one of my external drives, I'll have everything in there. It won't be spread out among my computer. All right, so getting back to this particular window, still kind of sparse, I agree with you. Let's talk a little bit about basic orientation in Pro Tools. There's several ways to skin the cat in Pro Tools. And in all different functions and tasks. So what I mean by that is there's several ways to do things in Pro Tools. let's talk about some ways to navigate. Probably the easiest one that you guys are going to want to use first is this tool right up here for navigation. So if I want to zoom out, and I'm still going to need to use this. It's centering around that, but that's all right. I'll still zoom out, but you'll notice it's getting larger horizontally. Okay, so or zoom in, zoom out, zoom in. I don't know why it's taking me over there. That's interesting, but I'm sure it's in my preferences. The other thing that you might want to do is zoom horizontally. So with Pro Tools 8, they did this. You could also make it bigger in other places, but this is probably the easiest way to do that. So you'll notice if I put my mouse there, it's going to turn into that, and I click down. You'll see my mouse turning red here. I'm clicking down and moving it up and down. So for basic navigation, that's probably, as a beginner, that's probably the best way to do it. Just using this, going in and out, and also going up and down that way, so vertical and horizontal. At that point, you might say, well, I think I want to get a little bit more advanced. So at that point, I would use the magnifying glass. So I just grab it, and then I highlight the section that I want to zoom into, and it'll go ahead and zoom into it. Now, if I hit the the Option key, I can zoom out. So it's the Option key, and I think it should, yeah, that's the Option key, by the way. So I can zoom out, or if I have it on, zoom in. Or I can kind of select a region or a space here, and it'll zoom into that particular place. So that's kind of the second way to go about doing all that. And my mouse is looking funky. I don't like to be on my magnifying glass, so I'll go back to my selector tool and have my arrow. All right. And the third way that the professionals are going to prefer with navigation is a shortcut. So that shortcut, let me go ahead and start teaching you some shortcuts. Watch the shortcuts here on the bottom, is going to be holding down the Command key on the keyboard and using your brackets. So the brackets are up in the right hand side by the Delete key. So hold down, you might call it the Apple key, but it's the Command key. And if I do left bracket, it's going to zoom horizontally in, and if I do right bracket, it's going to zoom horizontally out. So go ahead and try that yourself for a minute. Okay, and I typically use this. Now, if you take the DAW class, you'll learn shortcuts for everything. Like I think you'll use fat finger down for zooming it, which is Control Option Command down. So there's all these little tricks of other shortcuts, but to me, I only use the ones that are probably the most beneficial to what I'm doing on a daily basis, which isn't too many, but there are some ones that I'll use all the time. So that's one of them, the command bracket for zooming in and zooming out. All right, let's talk more. So this is also a navigation function. You can set different zoom levels, and those are predefined. Okay, so that's another thing just to be aware of as far as the zoom goes. We talked about the magnifying glass. Let's go ahead and talk about the tools. So the tools. And the beautiful thing about Pro Tools is that if you just sit and hover around it, it'll tell you what the name of the tool is. So I don't even have to remember it. But I've done it long enough that I know this is the trimmer. I call this the selector. Does it call that that? It's not going to give me a name. And the grabber tool. Okay. If you really explore, you'll notice these also have little drop-down arrows that do other stuff. But let's not worry about that at this point. We'll talk about those a little bit later. So the three tools here are really how you're gonna get around and manipulate the audio. Okay, so basically I'm going to move over to what we call slip mode, and I'll explain that in a minute, but we're going to try out the tools here on the drum beat. So the first thing we're going to try out is called the trimmer tool. So if you put it at the edge of a region and click down, you'll notice that it either drags it in or drags it out. Now once again, we're non-linear and we're non-destructive in digital. Non-destructive means I really don't screw anything up. It's not like recording over a magnetic tape or anything. If I'm careful, I'm pretty much going to have my original audio files, okay, which are over here. So one thing I want to show you real quick just so you can understand this concept of non-destructive. Here's the original file clip, and if you're not showing this window, you can go down here at the bottom of this arrow and show that window. And by the way, stop the video anytime you need to try a skill. You probably figured that out by this point, but so I'm having just one original clip, and then you'll notice it's in bold because it is the original clip that I imported. But watch what happens when I start trimming this clip. it all of a sudden created a secondary clip that's not bolded. So that what this is telling me is this is a region, okay? So this would be an audio file, if you were talking about terminology in Pro Tools, audio clip or audio file, and this would be a region technically, okay? It's still calling it an audio clip, but it's meaning the region is just a portion of that original. It just really what Pro Tools does is it references back to that original and says, okay, I'm only going to play the original for, 0.532 seconds of the original. So that's all it is going on there. And then you'll notice if I go over here, so that's what the trimmer tool does. But if I go over here to the selector tool and I delete a couple things, selector tool is just like the mouse on Microsoft Word. Now it's going to create several clips. And you might say, oh my gosh, how do I get back to where I was? Well, I'll go back to the handy dandy trimmer and just pull it right back out, right? So, whew, I didn't lose anything. I still have these clips going on, so if I still wanted that clip that I made some funkiness, I could still drag that over from the audio files window, which is kind of cool, right? So you have those edits that you made as well. Let's talk about the grabber tool. So we talked about the selector, just like a cursor on Microsoft Word, basically. Let's talk about the grabber a little bit. So the grabber grabs and it moves stuff, right? Not too hard to understand. Cool. Okay, let us talk about grid mode versus slip mode versus shuffle mode versus spot mode, the modes in Pro Tools. I think that would be the next thing to figure out. So slip mode, you'll notice, slip mode allows me to move, let's just take the grabber here, allows me to move the region or the audio clip anywhere I want to move it. I mean, I could move it, let me zoom in here. I can move it between 3 and 4 here, or between those two little lines there. What grid mode does, and that's primarily for working with music, is typically in music we work in bars. So you'll notice here we got bar 3, bar 4, bar 5, that kind of stuff. So let me go ahead and click on grid. Now what you're going to notice, depending on what my grid is set on here, up in the high right corner here, let's set my grid to bar. You'll notice, first of all, well, one thing you should notice is that the little lines change, right? So that's your grid value if you're on grid mode. And now it's only going to allow me to move this right on the grid, which is pretty handy because let's say I have 2 drum beats going on and I want to back them up together, like have one start on 3 and one start on 4. I want to move a chorus to measure from measure 2 to measure 6. It'll allow me to put it right there without having to try to guess. If I was on slip mode, am I quite there? Not really. I'm at 6.1070. That's not good. I need to be right on beat 1. So there we go. Put it back on grid. Shuffle, we won't use in music as much, but I'll go ahead and talk about it. So these are the two we're going to use in music the most, slip and grid. Shuffle allows us to, well, let me show you something first. If I'm on slip and I hit delete, it's just going to remove that section. And the timing of all these events is still going to stay the same. I'll go ahead and undo that. But watch what happens when I do that with shuffle. See how they butted up against each other? So it's basically going to change the timing. So a good use of shuffle, and really the only reason I ever use it in music is, let's say this is the complete song and I say, okay, I need to cut out the bridge, and the bridge happens between 3 and 4. I'm going to cut out that bridge of that song. Then I can switch over to shuffle after I've selected it on grid mode. Just hit delete, and now the bridge of the song is gone, right? Makes sense. Kind of like editing analog tape, to tell you the truth. Shuffle is. Okay, so let's undo that. Also, obviously undo, if you know, is Command Z on a Mac and Control Z on a PC. So spot mode. Spot mode basically is for film and television, and it allows us to set a time value. So if I wanted to say, okay, if I send this to someone doing film, I know that if I'm working in, let's go ahead and switch to minutes and seconds because they work in minutes and seconds, or samples, or excuse me, feet and frames for movies, I could set this sound effect to happen with that particular point on the video, and they would sync up. That's all spot mode is. So we're not going to use it too much. If you take the sound for picture class at Belmont, you probably will end up using spot mode a little bit. But in music, we don't really use it that much. Okay. So what else? We've talked about our tools. We've talked about our modes there, our edit modes. We need to maybe talk about the transport a little bit. You'll notice there's a few tools I haven't talked about yet, and we'll get into those, but they're not as crucial as these three. Let's talk about the transport. So first of all, if you're not showing the transport, you need to go up to Window, Transport, and you'll see that once again it has a shortcut. window transport, and you'll show your transport. Okay, so this is kind of like the tape machine controls. You may also, mine doesn't have it up here, but you may also have some controls up here. Let's see if I can show those too. Yeah, if I wanted to, I could show them up there. I typically don't. I typically deal with this transport, but some people don't like it because it does take up some screen real estate. I'm kind of old school though. And so these are all the controls that you'd be used to. This is go back or return to 0 from the beginning of the song. You'll notice my cursor, like for instance, my cursor's there. If I click there, it'll go back to the beginning of the song. This is rewind. This is fast forward. This is go to the end of the song. This is stop. So if I'm playing, play along there, I hit stop. Okay, yeah, it's stopping. Good. Record and play, obviously. Okay. Some other things, if I'm recording, pre-roll is basically a pre-count off before it actually starts the song. Post-roll is it goes after the song. If for some reason I wanted that. Count off, if I'm recording once again, it's going to give me a count off for the song if I want that. Tempo is going to be a little bit more critical to this one because this drum beat is telling me that it's at 100 BPM. So right now it's not lining up with bars and beats. So I'm going to go ahead and take this conductor guy off, and we'll talk about the conductor guy later, but what we call this manual tempo mode. I'm going to go ahead and enter my tempo of 100 BPM. And now this drum beat, if it was done right, yeah, it should line up. So it looks like it's a 4-bar drum beat. So let's just listen to it. Let's listen to it and watch the counter. In fact, I'm going to show the big counter here. And I'm going to switch the big counter to bars and beats. So you can just count the drum beat and watch it. 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Funky. 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. So it should line up now if it was done right, which I think it was. So a good exercise would be, okay, we know that this is now in bars and beats. So if we highlight that on grid mode, that's 1 bar. And what I can do now is just like Microsoft Word, I can copy, paste, copy, paste, copy, paste, and now I should have 4 bars of that first measure of the drum beat. Okay, I can use my transport to go back. Let's talk about some transport controls, by the way, that are shortcuts. Here's the big ones you're going to want to use. Return is the same as return to 0. So if you hit return on there, I'll probably do it all the time, not even realize it because I do it so much. It'll go back to the beginning of the song. So I'm gonna hit return again on my keyboard. Boom, back to the beginning of the song. The other one that you'll use all the time, probably more than any other shortcut, is your space bar is play and stop. Okay, let's say, well, you know, I don't like that. I'm going to go back to the original. Well, there's the original. Once again, non-destructive editing. But you can see the advantages of having slip mode and grid mode, right? Because if I have slip mode, it's going to be hard for me to go out and cut out an exact bar, especially if I'm dealing with music. Now, once in a while, we want to deal with minutes and seconds as well. So you'll see I have bars and beats up here, but if I want to also show minutes and seconds, like if I'm doing a radio spot and I want it to be 30 seconds long exactly, I can do that. Okay, so I can show minutes and seconds, and I can also change my counter to minutes and seconds as well. Like, you know, songwriters, you might want to say, well, how long is my song? You know, is it 3 minutes 30 seconds perfect for radio, or 3 minutes for radio? Well, I can see how long it is using that minutes and seconds counter there. But like I said, most of the time for music, we're gonna work in bars and beats. Okay, so I think we've really talked about most of the things we want to talk about. There's one other thing that I want to show you, and I do hesitate to show it to everyone, only because it's a secret weapon. And when you're first starting out, I would invite you to use all of these tools separately so you really learn, okay, the grabber moves, the selector selects, the trimmer trims, and really get comfortable with what each of those does. But we have a tool that's called the Smart Tool, and that combines, hey, this is the Smart Tool. It combines all of those functions plus more. So check this out now. I got that. So when I move my mouse down to the bottom there, it's going to turn into the trimmer and allow me to trim it. When I put it in the middle, it's going to be the selector. And when I put it somewhere there in the middle, it's going to turn into the grabber. So I didn't want to have to go back and forth to get everything off my toolbar. It changed to all 3 of those just depending on where I put my mouse. And then the other thing you'll notice is if I put it in the top corner, it turns into a fade. So if I click down and pull to the right or on this side, if I click down and pull to the left, we got fade in and fade out. But once again, this gets a little confusing until you get used to all your tools. But if you feel confident and you want to use that, I'll go ahead and undo that. Go for it and use that. So that's basically the introduction to Pro Tools. I didn't talk about the scrubber. I didn't talk about the pencil, but we'll talk about those later. Good luck.